For as long as I can remember, I've been telling people that the Armada series, both the first and second game, are solid entries in the Star Trek franchise. And while this may be true, there's just one problem I've recently realized. I've never actually played the second game. Welcome, my name's Azadesh and welcome to another PC game retrospective video. Several months ago I made a video on the first Star Trek Armada game. Apart from some questionable design decisions which I explain in the video, I enjoyed the playthrough and felt that the game aged quite well from when I first played it in the early 2000s. The actual copy of the game I played for that video came from GOG, so it wasn't overly surprising that several weeks after the purchase I got a notification in my inbox telling me that the sequel, Armada 2, was on sale. Not owning a physical copy of the game, and after enjoying the original, I decided to purchase it. I planned to capture some footage for it, although I didn't have an immediate plan to make a video about it, mainly due to the fact I just covered the first game and remembered the second being very similar. Upon purchasing it, I installed the game and began to watch the intro cinematic. It was at this moment that I first thought, I don't remember this intro. I guess I just never paid much attention to it. Once the game's menu loaded, I quickly bypassed the tutorials, believing that I already had a firm grasp on how to play the game, and proceeded to the first mission. After a short in-engine cutscene played, I was presented with the game's interface, and the first thing that stuck out to me was a menu command to separate a Galaxy-class starship into its two parts. I thought to myself, that sounds really cool. I can't believe I didn't remember this. Then I moved the mouse further along to open the AI menu to see a selection of AI options and thought, okay, I definitely haven't played this game before, as if I needed any more proof. Of course, after I realized this, I went about thinking just how I got so confused. Apart from just making a mistake, the only thing I can think of is that the game that I thought I remembered as Armada 2 was actually Starfleet Command 3. Both boxes have the Enterprise E on them, both boxes have nebulas on them, and both games were released less than a year apart. Whatever the actual reason for my original oversight, there was a silver lining to it, the chance to experience the game for the first time on modern hardware, along with all of the convenience that brings. The GOG version does include several major updates to improve compatibility. However, the one thing it does not include is support for widescreen resolutions. However, a fix for this can be downloaded separately, and I'll leave a link to this in the description. The fundamentals of the game are not too dissimilar to other RTSs of the time. The game includes both a campaign and a quick battle mode where you can play against other players online or create scenarios of your own. There's quite a roster of playable factions, including what I'm pretty sure is the first and only official time you can play as Species 8472. And look, the interpretation of 8472 is actually really good. For example, they don't build ships, they hatch embryos and then evolve them, kind of like some type of space Pokemon, although they sound a lot more angry than your average Pokemon.
Eliminate, kill, exterminate, destroy. The weak shall perish.
All of the other factions are also quite well realized, with each one feeling quite unique. For example, when the Federation colonize a planet, they basically send down colonists in small pods, whereas the Borg literally fire an assimilation beam straight at the planet. This is one example, but the game is filled with these little nods to the various factions, and it really goes a long way to making the player feel like they are playing as different factions as opposed to simple reskins. The story follows several protagonists of the Federation, Klingon and Borg as they grapple with the threat of Species 8472 invading the galaxy. Now, the story and Trek games of this era vary greatly in quality. There were games like Bridge Commander, which delivered an excellent story, games like Hidden Evil, which delivered a story more akin to questionable fanfiction, and then games like the first Armada, which were good enough. Unfortunately, Armada 2's story is much closer to questionable fanfiction than a bona fide classic. And look, there's a few reasons for this. The first is what I will call Borg fatigue. Now, the first game's storyline told several independent stories, but the main overarching story was one of the Borg trying to take over the Alpha Quadrant. In Armada 2, while the story does go in a slightly different overall direction, it literally starts off with the Borg once again trying to take over the Alpha Quadrant. Another reason I don't rate Armada 2's story is that while the first game told several independent stories and linked them together with an overarching plot, Armada 2 uses this same mechanic, but the independent stories just don't come together well enough to contribute to the overall plot. Lastly, and this may be subjective, I'm all for giving the established television lore some latitude in video games. However, there are moments in the story here that just directly contradict what we know about existing characters, to the extent that they behave in a manner which is just plot-breaking at times. I'm not going to go into full spoilers here, but there are things which Captain Picard says and does that pay zero respect to his character development in episodes such as The Best of Both Worlds and the movie First Contact. As I said, maybe this is just a me thing, and I will say it probably doesn't help that The Best of Both Worlds is one of my favorite Star Trek episodes of all time, but I certainly feel like the overall story went backwards when compared to that of the original title. Before we continue, a massive thank you to everyone who supports the channel. If you enjoy this content, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's build our fleet, engage our warp engines, and head back to 2002 to remember Star Trek Armada 2. Releasing just over a year after the first installment, Armada 2 borrows a lot from the original title while offering several new systems and mechanics aimed to add a bit more depth to the gameplay. The issue is that these new systems and mechanics are layered on the same game engine from the original, which results in unpredictable and sometimes frustrating consequences. One of the biggest changes from the original game is that the game now takes place in a fully 3D environment, as in you are not just playing the game on a 2D playfield with 3D objects, but a full 3D playfield. The game box even says, "Command from any angle, formation affects strategic and tactical decisions." And yeah, formation does affect tactical decisions. If you don't use it, you can control your fleets with relative accuracy. If you place your ships into various formations, you will face a slew of unintended consequences, ranging from some vessels not being able to participate in combat, and other vessels getting stuck on parts of the map. The other issue with formations, and to be fair, any ships that are not on the default neutral 3D plane, is that it can make it quite hard using the default view to get a good overview of exactly what's happening, and if needed, change selections of ships mid-combat. Now, there is another camera mode, the tactical view. However, while this is great for visual spectacle, it's not overly useful in combat, given it uses the same legacy selection tools that the standard view uses. The 3D plane also makes the placement of certain base items a challenge, as sometimes the boundaries of other items on the map, such as planets, are not easily apparent. However, the biggest issue with the gameplay changes the 3D plane delivers is that there's just no real reason to use it. There's no benefit. If you gained access to special abilities or something when you had a certain amount of ships in formation, then it might have been a reason to use it. But as it stands, there was never a time in the game in my entire playthrough that I found any benefit to either the 3D plane or using ship formations. Another statement mentioned on the box is a longer campaign, and yes, this is true. Armada 2 is a much longer game than the original. However, I would argue that the first game delivered a much more engaging experience. In the first game, you were always doing something, whether or not that was controlling a specific ship in some of the more focused missions, or accomplishing a list of objectives in some of the more open-ended missions. You as the player were always playing an active role in the game. In the sequel, while there are missions which see you playing an active role from start to finish, there are a lot of missions with the same objective of wiping out every enemy on the map. Due in part to some of the major balance changes from the original, this often results in frustration. Firstly, starbase offenses have dramatically been buffed to the extent that they can pretty much one-shot most lower-level ships and 2 to 3-shot most other ships, including the Enterprise. The impact this has on gameplay is that while in the past you could assemble small fleets of 5 to 8 ships and still stand a chance of destroying a starbase, you now need to send around 20 to 30 ships to take on a starbase. Now, this means building these ships, which takes time and resources. In isolation, the entire base building element of the game is pretty solid. There's somewhat of a tech tree with various prerequisites to build the more powerful structures, which in turn can build the more powerful ships, as well as a research system which allows you to research more powerful ship systems to increase the effectiveness of your fleet, and this is all pretty good. Likewise, the resource systems are also fairly solid. There's now dilithium, metal, latinum, and crew, which are used as resource elements, with some races being able to mine latinum for trade to dilithium or metal at a trading base. And in a nice touch, the Borg don't actually have a trading base, rather they have a recycling plant which can convert metal to dilithium and vice versa. The issue is that once you set up these installations, of which most of the resource generation is gated by planets and moons, there's not much more to do apart from waiting for your fleet to be built. And the issue is that all the game's units use the same resources, so if you do take a detour to do something else, that will only slow your fleet creation down. The other issue with these wiping out every enemy on the map missions is actually finding them, because even if there is one small ship remaining, you won't be able to complete the objective and pass the mission. There was a mission in the Klingon campaign where the only remaining objective I had was to eliminate all enemies on the map. The only problem was that despite having over 100 ships set to search and destroy, I couldn't actually find and destroy the last ship, which eventually resulted in me having to reload from a much earlier save. It kind of goes without saying, but this was not a good gameplay experience. Now, it's really clear that one of the development objectives was to create much larger scale conflicts, and this has certainly been accomplished. One of the things that does help offset managing many more ships is the AI system. Now, this is a menu item which lets you select things like how far ships can pursue enemies or how often they use their special weapons without your direct input. While special weapons played an important role in the first game, they are a core game mechanic in the second, with their use across all classes of ship practically required to not just survive, but to complete some of the time-based mission objectives. Your enemies will also use these same weapons against you, with the Borg in particular presenting a very substantial challenge with their unique special weapons. However, not even the Borg can hold a candle to the most deadly enemy in the game, nebulas. Now, nebulas were used in the first title, however here their use has been ramped up by a factor of 10. There's also more types of nebulas, all with various, often negative, effects for ships passing through them, meaning you need to pay close attention when moving large groups of ships so that you don't accidentally cross into one of the more deadly ones. I get the reason for creating areas of the map which present a challenge, however I think there could have been a bit more variety instead of just nebulas here. Overall, what made the first game fun is still here. It's often just buried under a bunch of new things, which more often than not complicate as opposed to complement. Armada 2's presentation is a bit of a mixed bag. Firstly, the good. The overall fidelity of the game is improved, with structures, ships and environments all getting a substantial uplift in quality. This is especially obvious when you enter the tactical view, given it gets you much closer to the action. Now, along with this newfound in-game fidelity, the developers elected to move the majority of cutscenes to in-engine cutscenes, as opposed to the mixture of in-engine and pre-rendered in the last game. And yeah, for the most part, it does look pretty good, but it does lose a little bit of the depth to the storytelling when you're relying purely on camera pans of an in-game environment to tell a somewhat complex story. There's also things which stick out as questionable decisions, like if you finish a mission where the last objective was to capture something, your ship will stay in the transporter animation for the duration of the next cutscene. It just makes the game feel like it lacks polish. As far as bugs go, there was nothing too serious apart from some unusual movement in selected ships, which I suspect stems from the move to the fully 3D environment, suggesting that this feature might not have had the most robust playtesting. Performance is really solid on modern machines, and I never ran into any crashes as such. Like the original, sound design is really good. You get several of the television series actors reprising their roles, and this really does help to sell the otherwise fairly lackluster story to the player.
Your orders are to take and defend all the planets in the system, including any that the Cardassians hold. Your defenses must be strong, and your assault overwhelming.
The Borg do not have the resources to properly deal with the 8472 threat. It would be in both of our best interests to cooperate in their elimination.
Starfleet is not interested in eliminating anyone.
Music and effects are likewise very good, with each of the playable factions having unique and appropriate sound design. Overall, there are certainly some issues with Armada 2, but sound is not one of them. Star Trek Armada 2 takes a lot of what made Armada 1 good and then adds a bunch of things which objectively make it worse. In reading through a lot of the game's initial reviews, it was quite often compared to being more of an expansion for Armada 1 than a standalone game, and thinking about it and what the definition of expansion was in the early 2000s, I tend to agree. In fact, I would go as far to say that had the game scope been reined in a bit, with the removal of the 3D playing field for example, and simplification of the story, this could have actually been a good expansion for the original. As a standalone game though, it doesn't really do enough well to help set it apart from some of the better expansions for other RTSs during this time. I get the idea that releasing Armada 2 was more about releasing a game than actually making a game. From my perspective, I can now at least say I have indeed played Armada 2, and while I don't think it's as good as the first game, there is absolutely something still here for Star Trek RTS fans. If you have ever thought you've played a game, only to find out that you haven't, let me know down in the comments below. But for now, that's enough from me, and as always, thanks for watching.